So sometimes neoclassicism, for all its morality and virtue, I always say sometimes it can go bad. What do I mean by this? I mean, sometimes it doesn't end up working, I think, like the user thought it was going to. Because it's such a very specific type of style, I think that sometimes you can try to apply it and it just frankly ends up looking kind of ridiculous. One of the most prominent examples I always reference, of course, is the Church of La Madeleine, which was created by Vignon. And right off, why I think this is a ridiculous neoclassical piece of architecture is because it's a church that looks like a pagan temple. So right there, you're left sort of scratching your head, I think. Why would you want to create a church, which is a monotheistic, you know, institution? Why would you want to create a Christian church using a polytheistic temple? Because the Greco-Romans, they were polytheists. They worshipped many different gods and they constructed temples to them using the type of architecture you're seeing here. So once Christianity emerged at the end of the Roman period, one of the first things that was really important was to take the idea of the Roman basilica and, reinvent it, right, in a sense. There was no use of pediment sculpture like you see here. They dropped the columns, right? They dropped a lot of the things that made a temple look like a temple. They kept the basic, basilical form, but they reinvented it. So again, sort of looking at this building, I'm often struck by how Greek it really looks. And again, I think it's sort of out of step with what a Christian audience probably would want. If you've never seen the Parthenon, here is a picture of it so you can get a sense of the one-to-one comparison of it side by side. So again, normally when you would go to like a Greek temple, you'd have the columns, the pediment, etc. The pediment, by the way, is that triangular area with the sculpture inside of it. And then there's the more, sort of obvious complication of the sculpture in the pediment on this church, which represents Jesus, but makes Jesus look like a Greek god. He kind of comes off as very Zeus-like to me, or Zeusian to me. And Christ's principles are not about this type of attitude. So I think this just doesn't really work out so well, and it's very odd, right? As far as its usage. Now, La Madeleine's history gets even more complicated because when the French Revolution fails, and then later they're going to have what's called the Commune period. It's going to be basically a socialist kind of led government within France before the final revolutionary push to the Republic of France as we know it today. This building actually was converted from a church to what they called like a temple of men or temple of knowledge or something, sort of along those lines of ridiculousness. So they actually, in a sense, took it from being a church to being not a church. Again, it just gets very complicated as far as the history of La Madeleine is concerned. And La Madeleine, of course, refers to Our Lady. It's a very typical way to dedicate a Marian church, as we put it, or a church to Mother Mary, the Virgin Mary, in the Christian tradition. The other piece I always show you that I'm like, yeah, I don't think this is really what neoclassicists wanted. What they really meant by using neoclassicism is the sculpture by Horatio Greneau of George Washington as Zeus. Now, this piece was commissioned to sit in the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And I didn't show you any of the Capitol architecture, but it's also very neoclassical, of course, and looks, like Greek temples. So when Greneau was asked to create the sculpture of George Washington, he was asked to basically use neoclassical principles. We think that Greneau was asked to make this piece also because Houdon had also made his piece, and it was a way of having a Native American sculptor also make a sculpture of George Washington as of the father of America. But unfortunately, it comes out a little bit like bizarre. I often wonder if we can really fault Greneau for this, because Greneau was probably just following directions. From all the documents we have, it seems that he was told, make something that makes him look like a Greek god, make him look stoic, make him look, perfect and idealized, because this is the buffest GW I've ever seen. He's like Socrates. He and Socrates go to the same gym. They're so perfect, right? But, Greneau seems to have been given very specific directions, and he makes the piece, and then when it's unveiled, the story is that people were like, oh God, what is that? That the reception to the piece was very chilly and even comical. And there's documents that suggest that Greneau was very hurt by this and very upset by this, and he didn't understand why the piece landed with a giant thud, kind of in front of everybody. And he was like, I made what you told me to. And supposedly the sculpture was such an embarrassment that it was not installed in the rotunda. It actually was hid in the basement. And when it was moved to the National Portrait Gallery, supposedly there was even talk of like maybe the crane should drop it or there should be a problem, it gets broken. So this was kind of a funny, comical, reviled statue in a way for very many, many years. Today it's prominently shown in the Portrait Gallery in DC, and but again, I think the hilarity of its history is still very much a part of talking about it. And why is it so hilarious? Well, I don't even think I have to say much. You can just look at it. It's the founding father of America being shown as, again, a Greek god. It's just doesn't play right. This is not our background in our history. American history is about, escaping religious persecution. It's about freedom and revolution. And I don't think, in a lot of ways, American history, like the foundation of our history, wants to kind of guide itself back to like the idea of our leaders as gods. So this idea that would even be considered blasphemous for a Christian nation in a sense. So, and you can say what you want about freedom of religion, all these other things, but you can look at founding documents and they often refer to Christian nation, all this kind of stuff. So I think again, it just doesn't read right for the audience at all. There's other things on it that are kind of disturbing as well. There's the Native American sort of bowing to him. You'll notice that on the left-hand side and in the right-hand image, they have this sort of Native American figure kind of bowing to him. And so there's things that people are openly like, wow, this is some racist stuff you got hidden in here. And they wouldn't be incorrect, obviously. If you look at the sculptures on the Capitol building, there's also some disturbing imagery you can find there as well. So again, I think Greneau's intentions were good to create something that aligned with neoclassical values and principles and beliefs, but I think sometimes your audience is just not correct, or sometimes the theme is not correct, and so it won't exactly work the way you think it'll work. So I always love to end on a more comical note here, because I think neoclassicism is rather heavy, and so I always give you George Washington as Zeus as a nice way to wrap up our talk about neoclassical. Next, we're going to be talking about Romanticism, and I've already kind of given you a little bit of thoughts about Romanticism, about the pendulum swinging from Stoicism back to emotion once more.